Why are you cramming? Is it because you want to put in the least amount of effort but get the best grade? Is it because it's something that you've always been doing and got the grades that you want? Or is it just because you leave your study to the last minute? If you relate to any of these, well, here's the thing. You should realize that cramming is not the most efficient way of getting things done. And it doesn't actually work as much as you would think it would work as well. So what should we do instead? Hey guys, if you're new here, my name is Archer and I'm a second year medical student, and on this channel we learn how to learn so we can spend our time more intentionally on the things that actually matter and the people that matter to us. Okay, so cramming, I mean, we've all done it before and you're probably going to do it again at some point in your life. But think about this, if you're trying to do cramming just so you can do the least amount of effort to get the highest grades possible, well then here's the thing, it's actually a fallacy, it doesn't actually work. If you actually learn how to study properly and your priority is not to get the top marks, you can actually focus particularly on the study techniques that would allow you to be as efficient as possible. And when I say efficiency, I'm talking about being time aware. Spending the least amount of effort and time to get the highest results is all what I think about when I'm using study techniques. I'm not really aiming to be the top student in medical school. I just want to get really high grades with not putting that much effort in, which is now what I do with all the study techniques that I use. And this is why I actually stopped cramming ages ago. So in this video, we're going to cover firstly why cramming does not work, the importance of sleep, and then how to actually not cram, which is going through some study techniques. All right, so let's go through it. This is why cramming doesn't actually work. So I love Sebastian Puri's videos and I saw this and I just had to mention it just before we get started. So you wouldn't expect to cram an 100 kilogram deadlift if you hadn't even trained anywhere before about learning how to deadlift in the beginning. And he also mentioned you wouldn't expect to be on a sugar high if you ate tons the night before. So here's the same thing when it comes to study. How can you really expect to have a really high knowledge and get a high grade from doing stuff the night before? And even cramming is still a week or even two before. You just cannot expect to cram everything in and be able to memorize all of it. If it was really that easy, everyone would be doing it and everyone would be getting perfect marks. Not only this, but cramming isn't necessarily something that people find enjoyable. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't find cramming enjoyable. It adds a lot of cognitive load onto yourself, which basically means that it adds a lot of stress, frustration, all these other negative emotions because you just got so much to do before you're even allowed to sleep and get ready for the test or exam the next morning. Keep in mind, I'm also referring to cramming as doing everything in 1 week before a test or exam. And then you might find that you run into some curveball questions, and those curveball questions are the questions like, I've never seen this before, I was never taught this, and then you just walk out of the test and someone tells you it was just this and this. It was easy. But those curveball questions are something you're just not gonna be prepared for, because you can memorize something 15 minutes before an exam, but you can't really expect to understand a concept completely for the first time, or maybe not even the first time, another time 50 minutes before an exam. It's much easier to memorize something as opposed to actually understanding it. And guess what the tests and exams that you're doing actually are asking for? They're asking for your understanding more so than your ability to regurgitate some definitions that you've written down in your notes. And here's the thing, one of the biggest things that why cramming doesn't really work as much as you want is that you need a good amount of sleep to actually learn things. This is called sleep-dependent memory consolidation, which is just a huge bunch of words. So let's break it down. So what this is basically saying is that in order for you to memorize particular things that you've been learning, even remembering the links between information that you've previously understood through more efficient study techniques, for example, without a sufficient amount of sleep, you are not going to remember those things the next morning. And here's the thing, you have no idea with the breadth and amount of knowledge that you're learning, what you've particularly forgotten until you've been tested on it. And if you don't have an objective way of testing, if you've gone through all the material and actually remember it before the test, well then the test is gonna do that for you. And it will properly test you if you know that thing or not. And then you'll realize that, oh, I don't actually know this. And then you'll realize that that's probably gonna cause some lost marks. So the biggest thing is that memorizing, remembering stuff is completely different to understanding things. You might be able to remember everything for the next morning when you have that test or exam, but that doesn't mean at all that you're going to be prepared for those harder A+ level questions, because they'll really see if you understand that material. All of this might mean that you remember it for the short term because it's actually stored in your short-term memory, but by the long term, you'll forget it. Now you might be saying, oh, it's just for this specific test. It doesn't matter if I forget it straight after, I'll just relearn it again. But if you're doing this for a test, you're gonna have an exam later on. So what this means is that you would have learned something in class and lectures and all that sort of stuff. You've forgotten it, then you've crammed it so you're ready for the test. You get an okay mark or something like that, but then you forget it all again. And then you'll have to relearn all of this sort of stuff for the various tests that you've had for one topic and then have an exam. So let's say that you might have maybe 4 tests and 1 exam at the end of the year. You would have to do that process 4 times over. You would be looking at the same content more than enough times because you'd forget it after that test. And particularly with cramming, because it doesn't go towards your long-term memory, you'll pretty much only know, and the studies show this, that you'd pretty much only know 20% of the information after sitting that test. So here's the thing that I just have to emphasize so much. If you actually spend the proper time to look at study techniques and your aim is to not study that much, well, if you focus on those study techniques, you'll actually be able to reduce not only the time you spend studying, but also even increase your retention and your understanding to get better grades as well. Okay, so let's dive a little bit more beyond just a sleep-dependent memory consolidation. That's completely interrupted if you are spending nights up longer than you need. The studies actually show for those who are teenagers, and particularly those going through year 12 and first year of uni and all this sort of stuff, the Johns Hopkins University says that you should have at least 9 hours of sleep. And I pretty much know that most of my friends are not having that much amount of sleep. I actively prioritize this because one of the biggest things in being able to like retain the things and all of the effort that you put towards study is being able to have a good sleep. And if you're saying that you can't fit in everything, there are still people who are fitting in everything. So what this means is that your efficiency isn't quite there yet. And we already know how important sleep is, so why do you keep sacrificing it? You know how easy it is to make mistakes when you're tired, and that's just putting your hard work to waste. I mean, I'm not sure if you've heard, but there's literally studies that show that pulling an all-nighter or not getting enough sleep is as bad as being drunk. In fact, if you pull an all-nighter, which I highly, highly do not recommend, that's as bad as a 0.1 BAC. And so, I mean, you wouldn't sit at an exam drunk, so why would you do this to yourself? The less sleep that you get, the closer you're getting towards that level. And beyond this, it's not just about what you memorize and things, it's also the mood that you go into and the focus and concentration that you have going into that test or exam. So let's talk about the study techniques that will help you specifically combat cramming. Like I mentioned before, relearning content that you've already looked at in the beginning is the single-handedly biggest time waster that's around. The reason for this is usually because the study techniques that you are using right now are actually not leading to too much learning. Now, what do I mean by that? When I say learning, the definition I'm really referring to is you being able to retain something for a really long time and being able to recall it, but also being able to apply it to many unfamiliar contexts. Usually this happens for people when they're cramming a few days before their exam or test, which effectively means that everything you were doing beforehand was kind of you just wasting time because you had to re-look at everything within that week before. Effectively, to pinpoint it, the fact that you had inefficient study techniques is the reason that you've had to lead yourself towards cramming. So how do we avoid this? Well, the biggest thing is actually building this understanding of things. And how do we do that? And the biggest thing when it comes to understanding things is not actually just having down all of the information in front of you. It's actually more so about building relationships between all the pieces of information, because that's actually how our brains work in terms of neuroplasticity and stuff. Your brain will remember the links between those pieces of information more so than just isolated facts all around the place. I mean, it goes without saying, right, that everything you write, you don't memorize. But when you take the time to actually see how our brains work, we're always building off foundational information that we already have. You can't teach a baby algebra. You have to teach them counting first. And then when they get a really good foundation about counting, then you can start introducing algebra. And usually that happens when they're a little bit older. The same goes with being able to learn quicker. If you know more stuff, you have more foundational information that you can build relationships off and sort of creating a tree of information. That's why techniques known as mind mapping and inquiry-based learning are extremely effective. So with mind mapping, you are creating those relationships between these different pieces of information and putting it down on paper. This is so much more effective than writing linear notes. So what I mean by linear notes are like having headings and dot points and all this sort of stuff. Because if you think about it, with your linear notes, you cannot technically make all the relationships clear. And if you did, you'd be just having lines absolutely everywhere. That's why writing notes down onto Notion or putting them onto flashcards doesn't actually quite work. And there's a lot of research around freehand drawing and why that is actually better. And when you do things like mind maps in terms of leading towards actual learning. This is the disadvantage with putting concepts and ideas on flashcards, is that you're presenting information in isolation, which means that there is no relationships drawn up when you show yourself that flashcard. And if you were to create a flashcard with a concept and all of the other concepts that it relates to, you'd have like a million flashcards. And the thing is that you're not going to be able to have all of these relationships written out before a test as well. But if you know how everything is already related, well then once you're tested on a particular question which requires you to know a particular link, you'll be able to see it quicker. This is why mind mapping is extremely useful, and I have a whole video on this explaining it in a little bit more detail, and that's coming up. But the other thing that you really want to focus on is inquiry-based learning, and particularly asking why is this important and how does this relate to the information that I already know. It basically means that you're learning through asking questions. And the thing is that when you use your curiosity in this particular way, you'll always be asking questions on the things that you're weakest at the moment. So when you ask a question about why it's important, well, firstly, you're going to be having to figure out what is that particular thing before you can figure out why it's important. And you don't need to go into the details yet, but this allows you to hinge it off other pieces of information that you currently know, which is why we ask the question, how does this relate to the other things that I've learned before? Then you can really think about mind mapping all this sort of stuff. So what we're really doing here is creating structure between the information so that we can, think about how all these things are related to each other. And, in a question as well, we'd be able to go zoom in small picture to maybe how the DNA and proteins actually work, and then go big picture and explain how that affects evolution itself. All right, so hopefully some of these techniques have helped. And if you want to learn more about reducing cramming, make sure to check out my other videos about all the other study techniques that are out there. Every study technique has a flaw, which is why it's so important to have a toolkit of all of the different study techniques for the right issues and problems that come at you. Practice questions have issues. Active recall has issues. Inquiry-based learning has issues. Mind maps has issues. But you need to be using the right tool for the right job. All right, so that's it for this one. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.